Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Welcome to the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California, and today's discussion with the co-directors of the documentary Free Chol-Soo Lee. I'm John Zipper, the club's Vice President of Media and Editorial, and I'm Michelle's co-host for our program. At the Commonwealth Club, we're producing hundreds of programs a year on a wide variety of issues, online as well as in-person programs. So head over to commonwealthclub.org/MMS for some more upcoming Michelle Meow shows, as well as video and audio of our past events. If you're watching live on YouTube, add your questions to the chat box and we'll work them into our discussion here today. Now, let's meet Michelle Meow, the producer and host of the Michelle Meow Show and a member of the Commonwealth Club's Board of Governors. Hello again, Michelle.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon for this program. In the early 1970s, a 20-year-old Korean American named Chol-Soo Lee was convicted of a Chinatown gang murder. Sentenced to life, he spent years fighting to survive until investigative journalist K.W. Lee took a special interest in his case. And it ignited an unprecedented social justice movement that would unite Pan-Asians, Asian Americans, and inspire a new generation of activists. And so here to chat with us about a documentary that is being released Friday, tomorrow, here in the San Francisco Bay Area at the Roxy Theater are the directors of Free Chol-Soo Lee, Julie Ha, and Eugene Yi. But before we get to the conversation, let's check out the trailer.
Oh, I was not an angel on her side. At the same time, I was not the devil.
In San Francisco, Chinatown, there have been a dozen unsolved murders.
Yip Yi Tak was gunned down execution style.
Shot from behind by a Chinese man in his early 20s.
Chol-Soo Lee had been involved in a gun going off in his hotel room 2 days earlier. That locked the police into Chol-Soo Lee.
Chol-Soo arrested for a Chinatown murder. People knew that the Korean didn't do it.
It didn't take a genius to find out what went wrong.
Chol-Soo Lee is charged with murder.
The jury found Lee guilty and sentenced him to die in the gas chamber.
It's hard for me to comprehend that I am on death row for crimes I did not commit.
Pouring a Korean Chinese.
The judicial system continued to remain ignorant and insensitive.
You don't distinguish facial features of other racial groups. This case started in this kind of racism.
For too long a time, the Asians been on the subject of racial injustice in the history of America. I think this is time Asian community came forth and said enough is enough.
We came across a newspaper article and we both said, hey, it sounds like this man is innocent. That's really where the Chol-Soo Lee movement started.
The Chol-Soo Lee movement had a life of its own.
So many people were involved.
We're continued and determined to fight.
Everything hangs in balance.
His was a case of an injustice.
We're all unified around a common goal, which is to free Chol-Soo Lee.
It happened in America, but only in America we can right this wrong.
Julie, Eugene, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon, and thank you for this film. You know, when I had heard about it, heard that the documentary was coming out, especially here in the San Francisco Bay Area, I was a little bit ashamed because I did not know the story of Chol-Soo Lee. And so we'll get in, a little bit about why that is, but maybe a good place to start for both of you is to learn how each of you learned of Chol-Soo Lee yourself. Julie, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. Actually, Eugene and I both learned about the case through K.W. Lee, the journalist in the film, whose series of stories helped trigger this landmark movement. I actually met K.W. Lee when I was 18 years old, doing an internship at a Korean American newspaper he started. I was actually blown away by K.W., who's an incredible force of nature, and actually inspired to become a journalist at that time, and just to learn of that there could be a case of a Korean immigrant who's wrongfully convicted in our American criminal justice system, and that it could be the work of a journalist and an entire group of people led by Asian Americans to win his freedom. That actually was quite mind blowing to learn as an 18-year-old, and it really helped shape the rest of my life. Yeah, and so you know, in terms of though, like making this film, Eugene and I, even though we've known about it for a long time, and Eugene met KW in his 20s, we didn't really think to make a film about this until, you know, late 2015. And Eugene is actually he's always had one foot in journalism and one foot in film and video editing, and we had worked together as journalists for a Korean American magazine called Korean Journal, and really had always shared a passion for telling complex Asian American stories with nuance and depth. And that magazine was folding, so Eugene said, like, let's maybe make a film together. And I think at any other time I would have said, no, that sounds crazy. I don't know how to make a film. But at this particular time, I had been thinking about the Chol Soo-lee case a lot. And that's because 9 months earlier, I had attended the funeral for Chol Soo, and to write an obituary for my magazine, but also to check on KW, who was in terrible anguish to have outlived Chol Soo, to whom he had become a father figure. And at the funeral, there was just this emotion there that was beyond grief. It was like a heaviness, and many of the activists who had come to Chol Soo's aid were there. One of them said, in the end, he did more for us than we did for him, which was such a striking statement, since I knew the movement was 6 years long. And then at one point, KW Lee stood up, and he was clutching the Buddhist monk's walking stick Chol Soo had carved for him. And he was a little angry. And he said, you know, why is this story still underground? You know, this landmark pan-Asian American social justice movement, why is it not even taught in Asian American studies in American colleges and universities? And so fast forward, you know, Eugene and I talking 9 months later, and, you know, I spoke about the heaviness with him. And we just both knew that this story was too important to allow to stay buried in history, that we actually felt a generational responsibility to tell it anew.
So how, I mean, I've seen the film and it's fantastic, and I certainly recommend everyone who has a chance get to see it. You talk to a lot of people. You show obviously archival video of a lot of folks. How difficult was it to get the people you spoke with to talk, and B, were the materials like with, again, like Michelle, I hadn't heard about this before. She brought this program to me, and so was it difficult to find information on it, or was this kind of one of those things where no one was looking, and you know, the videos were there, the articles were there, the interviews were there? What was it like getting this to pull it together?
Yeah, I mean, we really have to credit KW Lee with opening up a lot of doors for us. He introduced us and connected us with a lot of the activists and the filmmakers, the journalists who were involved at the time. And people were incredibly generous with their time, their experiences, and with the contents of their closets, because almost to a person, it seemed like everybody kept a box of something or other related to the Chol Soo-lee case, whether it was posters and these beautiful posters from the 1970s that really just sort of channel the artwork of the time, or these petitions, what have you, or in some cases, you know, video recordings and audio recordings as well. And it kind of speaks to, I think, how seminal of a moment not only it was for the people who were involved with the movement, but kind of this shared and unspoken recognition that this was history that was worth preserving. Because, you know, this footage was there, this material was there, but they made this decision to keep it and to essentially turn it into archival footage. Like, it wouldn't be archival footage for us today if it were not for what they had done. I mean, a special shout has to go to Sandra Jin, who created the first sort of television documentary about the Chol Soo-lee case in 1983. Now, that case, or that program ended with his release. But she sort of kept following the case and filmed other interviews with Chol Soo-lee over the years, and shared them with us in this incredible act of trust and generosity that really we're just eternally grateful for. And if it wasn't for everything that all of these activists, filmmakers, journalists had done back then, if it wasn't for what they had put together, we truly would have no film to speak of today.
Hearing Chol Soo-lee's story makes me think about, well, how many others are there when we talk about racial injustice, and then we include conversation about sloppy police work or police corruption, or even the injustice that we face in the criminal justice system. I'm not sure if, let's say, for example, mainstream media would want to pick up a story that impacts the Asian American experience or Asian Americans in general. And so we'd love to hear, from you, what was striking about Chol Soo-lee's case and why this absolutely is not just a San Francisco Bay Area story, but an American story.
You're right. It wasn't picked up actually when this happened to Chol Soo-lee, this wrongful conviction. And really, when you look at the evidence or lack of it that led to his conviction, it's quite striking. There was actually no material evidence linking him to this murder, and even the eyewitness descriptions of the actual killer did not match the physical description of Chol Soo-lee. They described a much taller man who was clean shaven, and Chol Soo-lee was, shorter man and also had a mustache. In addition, you see in our film how, when KW Lee, the journalist, investigates the case, and he just looks at court records and sees how the arresting police officer on the stand during the murder trial points to Chol Soo-lee and says, that Korean man, or no, I'm sorry, that Chinese man. And even Chol Soo's own defense attorney does not correct that, for the record. And it's almost unbelievable. And that's what KW said, as he says himself, it didn't take a genius to figure this out. And looking through police records and court records, he could not believe the holes in the investigation, the judicial bias he witnessed. Yes, this kind of profiling, or that, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, they all look alike. And so, and even doing the legwork in Chinatown, people would tell him, the Korean didn't do it, because Chol Soo-lee sort of stood out in Chinatown as this lone Korean. So even people in Chinatown knew that. But it speaks to, I think, the fact that this actually happens all the time in our country, unfortunately. We aren't used to seeing, though, this with Asian Americans, right? It's not that it doesn't happen, but we don't see stories about them. And so we do hope that with our film, we can help people sort of connect the dots with what's happened in our past, this kind of anti-Asian racism that expresses itself not just in like microaggressions, but in anti-Asian violence, or in cases like this of racial profiling that, some destroyed a person's life, because it's so hard to undo that kind of damage of racism. But connecting those dots between our past and what's happening now, it feels like it's a moment where people are starting to acknowledge the racism against Asian Americans, exists, as we're seeing this horrible rise in anti-Asian violence. So we do feel like our film does play a role in trying to make people more aware of that.
Maybe we should go back to the beginning, if you will, of Chol Soo-lee himself, because his life from day one, it sounds like, he was facing challenges. It was almost tragedy after tragedy. Tell our viewers, because again, most of our viewers and listeners will not have known the story either. Sketch out his early life and what led him to being accused, to being in a position, I guess, of being accused of this murder.
Yeah, so I mean, he started off with almost every institutional disadvantage you could imagine. I mean, he was a child of war and grew up in a broken family during the Korean War. I mean, happily, he was raised by a loving aunt and uncle, but he eventually did, and his mother left Korea and married an American GI to come to America to try and seek opportunity. He rejoined his mother at age 12, but once here, did not receive any of the kinds of support that an immigrant, and particularly young immigrant, would need. There was no language support. There was no transitional support for him. So he was bullied mercilessly, and he was a smaller child too. So it was a difficult environment for him to get to adjust to in America. And he went from school to school, eventually going to a school with mostly Chinese children. But he was, of course, unable to communicate there either because he could speak Korean and not Chinese. Eventually, there was an altercation with another student that led to him being taken to the principal. He had sort of an outburst of anger at the principal, and he actually was charged for battery for that incident. The law enforcement was involved, and that sort of began his involvement in the school to prison pipeline, with trips to juvenile hall and back, even sort of a stint in a mental institution, where it was eventually discovered that it wasn't mental illness, but or schizophrenia, but it was the fact that he was a Korean speaker, and no one had sort of recognized that until he had already been there and subjected to that treatment. And so he just sort of faced all of these obstacles that I think when you're at the intersection of race and class in a way where everything breaks wrong, this is what can happen. And this is before he'd spent even a day in prison for the 1973 for the 1973 murder that he was eventually arrested for. So those are the circumstances that really kind of sketched out his life up to that point.
Julie, do you want to pick it up from there and talk about that 1973 shooting and what led to his arrest, and especially going back to, again, the police officers' initial, I guess, response and the reason why they would have even thought that he was the alleged shooter?
Sure. So, there was a murder of a Chinatown gang leader named Yip Yee Tak that happened in June of 1973. And it was witnessed by dozens of Chinatown residents, but it was only 3 white eyewitnesses, three out-of-town tourists who came forward and talked to police about whom they saw. As I mentioned earlier, they did describe a man who was much taller, between 5'6" and 5'10", clean shaven, at the time they were interviewed. By the time of the murder trial, that description had evolved, and they identified Chol Soo-lee at the trial. But what put police on the tail of Chol Soo-lee in the first place was a gun accident that occurred, where Chol Soo-lee had borrowed a gun, and he was playing around with it one day, and it went off, and the bullet shot into his wall. The police came, filed an incident report. He wasn't arrested for it. But when the police were looking into this Yip Yee Tak murder, they found that gun accident report, and it had happened just before the murder. And so they did a ballistics test, and unfortunately, the ballistics test was false, but they didn't know it at that time, and they said it was a match, that the bullet shot into Chol Soo's wall was actually from the murder weapon. That was actually proven false after the preliminary hearing, but before the first murder trial. But even so, the police and the DA just stuck with this case. And it just goes to show you that our criminal justice system does not self-correct, even after a mistake like that is discovered. And so, basically he went to trial. Actually, his trial was held in Sacramento, and he had a court-appointed attorney who didn't really investigate the case very, very well, and he was convicted by a jury and sentenced to life in prison at one of the most violent California prisons at the time, which was ravaged by racial gang warfare. And once again, as he spent so much of his life as a loner, he was once again alone, like this lone Asian prisoner at Dual Vocational Institution.
And that led to him actually killing someone, which is a whole other story, would become a whole other case, but obviously is connected to this happening in a place he shouldn't have been in anyway. Have we ever, do we know that what happened just from what he's told us, or did any, because what this, for the viewers who don't know what we're talking about, this involves an intergang conflict. He wasn't a member of either gang. He actually was, he tried to be on good terms with both sides. And I don't know if they said the name of the gang, but it was a white Aryan gang or something like that. Mm-hmm. And they decided, nope, this is, they were going to go after him. So, I mean, his thing, he says it was self-defense. Are we confident that that was the case?
Well, as Ranko Yamada, the activist in our film who actually befriended Chol Soo before his arrest for this murder, as she says in our film, no matter what, like where the knife came from, or she says what you had for breakfast that day, like the fact that Chol Soo Lee was in prison in the first place for a murder he did not commit, and then he is like confronted by this prison gang violence. What is he supposed to do? How is he supposed to defend himself? There, as Chol Soo also says, there's no place to run, within the prison system. Like and you can't not stand up to this kind of confrontation. Chol Soo, we know from his memoirs that he wrote, his prison memoirs, he tried very hard to negotiate the relationships in prison, being the lone Asian. He wanted to try to get along with everyone. He said he had to be very motivated to actually diffuse potential conflicts and tension so he could avoid things like this. But when a gang puts out a hit on you and brings this man Morrison Needham from the Aryan Brotherhood, brings out prison-made knives to that confrontation. What do? You defend yourself. And even though this man was much larger than Chol Soo Lee, by the way, Chol Soo was, I think he was faster, and he knew what was going to happen to him. I think people could speculate all they want about, like, did he have his own prison-made knives? Was he ready, for this kind of confrontation? But I think we have to remember what Ranko Yamada said. If you're put in that kind of situation, what choice do you have?
I'm glad you brought up his memoir, and because the way that the documentary is made is you have someone narrate right in the documentary, which makes it sound like is Chol Soo Lee himself telling the story of his life. Tell us why you decided to put it in this way, and then finding the right voice of Chol Soo Lee that many of us actually don't know.
Yeah, we really wanted to make sure that Chol Soo Lee had agency in our film, that he could tell his own story on his own terms. And so, we actually, Eugene and I had sort of a hard time in terms of, for many years, feeling like we weren't quite doing justice to Chol Soo Lee's voice as much as we were immersing ourselves in all his words, all his interviews, his letters, everything he left behind, feeling like we're not quite getting to the heart of him. And so it was really the incredible discovery of our producer, Sue Kim, finding our narrator, Sebastian Yoon. And after he joined our team, it felt like everything fell into place. Sue had seen Sebastian speaking at an event for another documentary called College Behind Bars. And that documentary followed incarcerated men and women as they're allowed to take college courses and earn their degrees from prison. And Sebastian was one of the people they followed. He had been released from prison in 2019. And so that's why he was at that event talking about that film. And Sue said when she saw him speak, she was just so moved by his honesty, his openness, his genuineness. And there was some quality about him that reminded her of Chol Soo Lee. Maybe it was that innate friendliness that KW Lee talks about in our film. And so she just felt instinctively he could be the voice of Chol Soo Lee. So she told Eugene and me about him, and we watched the documentary series. We were equally blown away by him. And so we reached out, And he was quite surprised to know that an Asian American team was working on a film about a formerly incarcerated Korean American, but pleasantly so. And he agreed to just join us after watching a rough cut of the film. He said the story of Chol Soo-lee resonated quite deeply with him, and he could relate to him. And he actually collaborated with us on the script for what Chol Soo-lee says in the film. He read his memoirs, he looked at his interviews, and actually Sebastian said he actually felt this strong obligation to Chol Soo because he's no longer with us, to make sure he spoke up for him, to make sure that when audiences saw this film, they wouldn't be so quick to judge Chol Soo for failing a community, for not delivering sort of the fairy tale ending that maybe this movement wanted for him after his release. He wanted people to have some kind of empathy for Chol Soo. And so Sebastian really took it upon himself to really dig deep and even revisit his own trauma of incarceration, to try to bring out the emotion and the feelings of what Chol Soo-lee endured while in prison. He emphasized to Eugene and me that it wasn't just prison violence Chol Soo confronted, but it was the depression, the loneliness, the isolation. And as you can see in our film, those are aspects and scenes that are very key in our film, to try to really flesh out what happens with incarceration. And so Sebastian just does a remarkable job of also just narrating, and we feel like his voice really, you can feel that lived experience as well.
You mentioned a couple, obviously already now, K.W. Lee and his role. Tell us how he became involved, and obviously what kind of happened as a result of his writing about this. But then I also have another related question, which is, if K.W. Lee had not come along and an interest in this, what do you think would have happened?
I mean, more than one person told us that K.W. Lee's stories launched the movement. I mean, he initially became involved, he told us, because he read a newspaper brief about Chol Soo-lee, saw the name, and knew immediately that it was a Korean name. Chol Soo, it's one of the most common Korean names you can have. He actually had a nephew named Chol Soo, and it's even used in children's books. It's kind of that common. And so KW proceeded to start an investigation on his own time, for 6 months, driving from Sacramento to San Francisco to do this investigation, and just to sort of cover all the things that the film explores and that Julie's mentioned already. And the interesting thing about Chol Soo's case is that at the time, at least, Chol Soo spent 4 years in prison before K.W. Lee's stories came out. And his case did not immediately become a cause célèbre. Like, it was not immediately seen as a political case. So once K.W.'s stories came out, it accomplished a couple of things. One, it humanized him, of course, and told of everything that he'd been through just as an individual, and all that he had faced in terms of the institutional racism and the barriers that he had in his life. But secondly, it politicized the case. It turned his story into one that, to activists and people at the time, could be seen as a political case. I mean, back then, prison liberation movement, a lot of conversation about the carceral state was really quite at the forefront of what was going on. And a lot of the younger activists in particular, sort of a lot of these third generation Asian American activists, were very inspired by the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, a lot of what was going on. And so there was this connection that they could make from Chol Soo's case to a lot of these issues that were hot button issues at the time, but it was in their own community. It was for an Asian American, and we were told, Jeff Adachi, who sadly passed away before we were able to complete the film, but he told us that, this was a cause that they could all get behind, as Asian Americans, and and that's sort of what led. That's kind of what launched the movement, that union between them and a lot of these first generation immigrants who, in their own lived experiences, had experienced a lot of what Chol Soo had faced. which itself is quite extraordinary, of course, because a lot of them were sort of more conservative church-going elders, Korean immigrants who might not necessarily seem like the most natural fit with third generation Asian American radicals, but they found common cause in this case. And I mean, it's difficult to really conjecture kind of what would have happened if KW hadn't come along. I think it's, I think for us, it's more important to recognize that he did, and that there was this moment where, you know, we used this line in an early fundraising trailer where KW talked about how stars aligned. And this was certainly a moment where all of these factors really came together to allow this incredible moment in history occur.
I'll add on, question to that, just to stay on that topic. I mean, I was thinking about, right, like who believes you when you are powerless, when you, as Chol Soo-Lee had felt like very lonely, like who out there is going to believe you? And then here comes the community, right? A community, a journalist, a public defender, and a defense committee, and strangers then all of a sudden. And so I wanted to get both of your thoughts on, right, the importance of the Asian American community and why it matters that we are judges, we are lawyers, we are journalists, we're filmmakers, and that we tell stories.
Yeah, I mean, as we've mentioned before, it was not until 4 years into Chol Soo's sentence when KW stumbled upon this story and started writing about it, and a movement formed. But what happened in those 4 years, the San Francisco newspapers and reporters had heard about this case. Why wasn't it picked up, right? And there were apparently a few activists that were trying to reach the reporters at the San Francisco papers to try to see if they would look into this case, saying, this guy didn't do this. We should also mention Ranko Yamada. Before there was even a movement, she tried on her own as Chol Soo's friend to find defense attorneys to take on Chol Soo's case, because she actually knew he was at serious risk of being railroaded and convicted of this. But she didn't have enough money to pay them. And she said even progressive attorneys, cause-minded attorneys, would not take the case because they thought it wasn't political enough. And so, yeah, it is important. I mean, when you think about KW Lee, he actually said, this was the first story where it involved a Korean immigrant like himself. And in the past, KW had led such a storied career as a reporter, working at newspapers in the South, even as a very pioneering Korean immigrant journalist. He covered the civil rights movement, Jim Crow South. He embedded himself with poor families in Appalachia, West Virginia, before coming to the Sacramento paper and covering stories there, and was really writing mostly exposés. But when he came upon the Chol Soo-Lee case, the first time he got to write about a Korean immigrant, as he says in the film, he felt that kind of telepathy, and that kind of connection to him. And I think, he told us actually that in a way, Chol Soo awakened his own latent Korean identity. And so, yeah, I think it does speak to that kind of identification you can have with the subject, that gives you deeper insight, that also you can provide more context and historical context, personal context for the story. And when you think about the two stories, the two front page stories KW Lee wrote initially about the case, the second poked holes in the police and DA's investigation and case. But the first story, as Eugene mentioned earlier, really humanized Chol Soo-Lee. It made him seem like this person who could be your brother, your son, your grandson. And that's why the story had the power to launch a movement, because KW Lee had that perspective and lens and could tell the story in that way, in that kind of affecting way that could make people connect to Chol Soo-Lee on this human level. And also, I think his story gave voice to a lot of Asian Americans and including Korean immigrants who just felt that the sting of racism or being unwelcome in this country. And KW stories about Chol-Soo, I think, gave them that kind of connection and that outlet. And so, you know, it touched something in them that they would be willing to dedicate themselves to a stranger for 6 years to free him.
It was very impressive watching the scenes with his supporters, you know, people who really didn't know him, but knew his story and maybe had talked with him or certainly talked with his attorneys. But their enthusiasm for him and for his case, even as, you know, there's the scene in there where we're seeing the transcript, I guess, of what this judge is saying. So I think this was in was it his retrial? His initial retrial, or the trial?
Was it the death penalty? Maybe the death penalty trial for the prison yard murder case.
Talking about the racial makeup of the jury, is that?
Yeah, and the judge is like, well, I just see a bunch of Asian faces there, or something like that. I mean, they were also up against clearly some you know, just the racial structures that was set up against them. But so briefly, because we could go through the movie minute by minute, and we want people to see the movie, but take us to then that trial and what happened and his eventual freedom, or the first freedom, I guess we can call it.
Well, I'll first speak, like, again, to the power of that archival imagery, and this kind of connects to Michelle's previous question, just about how incredible those images are, and how I think, especially for Asian Americans, we're just so hungry for those kinds of images. Just to see these images of strength and resistance rather than a victimhood, I think, is just something that can be tremendously inspiring to people today. But yeah, the moment you're talking about was sort of the trial for the prison yard killing. Eventually, they were able to get a retrial for the original Chinatown killing, at which point they had raised enough money to hire these incredible defense lawyers. I mean, some of your listeners may know their names because they're quite well known in the Bay Area: Tony Serra and Stuart Hanlon, who are both just extraordinarily, uncommonly gifted litigators and defense attorneys. And they were able to really poke holes in a lot of what the original evidence had been that had convicted Chol-Soo, some of the stuff that Julie mentioned earlier. And they were eventually able to eventually able to procure his freedom. I mean, importantly, they were able to find an Asian American, a Chinese American witness from the neighborhood who was willing to take the stand. And I think, you know, it bears mention that, you know, at the time of the original Chinatown killing, it was a time of tremendous violence in Chinatown. There was a youth gang war essentially going on. There had been about a dozen unsolved murders at the time. And in that situation, there's also a way to connect it to so many other situations that you see in communities of color today, where you do have, again, race and class working in this way. If it's a violent situation, it can lead to over-policing. It can lead to sort of these kinds of conclusions. And I think some of that affected the situation in terms of Chol-Soo's original conviction, and, you know, Tony Serra, Stuart Hanlon, as well as, you know, members of the defense committee who joined as young lawyers, Asian Americans, including, we should mention, Ranko Yamato, who had decided to go to law school to try and work on cases like Chol-Soo's, and by this point had completed law school and joined as a defense attorney, his legal team, which is just incredibly inspiring of a story. Every time I think about it, like it's just, I mean, it's amazing, her commitment to sort of helping to right this wrong. But they were eventually able to overturn that murder conviction, and through a series of legal circumstances related to the prison killing, get him out on bail. I should mention that, and we don't get into this in the film, but he had to get out on bail for the prison killing, for the prison that we were talking about earlier against the white supremacist. Members of the defense committee put their own property up as property bonds to be able to make that bail. And even though the amount did not quite get to the number that the bail was set at, the judge was impressed enough to grant bail nonetheless. And so again, it just speaks to kind of some of the things we've been talking about, just the incredible depth of commitment and empathy and connection that people had to the movement, and the sense that they were all in this together to right this wrong.
I know we talked about, timing, how long it took to get this film to where it's at today. It's about to be released tomorrow at the Roxy. I hope you all go see it. I think everybody needs to see it. But what I wanted to say was, I think the timing is impeccable. And the reason why I say that is because we are starting to have these very honest conversations about wedges being driven within our communities and we have the impact of COVID-19, the scapegoating of Asians, the blaming of, the pandemic. And this idea that I feel like we have to redefine, who Asians are. And the story of Chol Soo-lee is a story of so many Asians that get left behind or get silenced, which is, it's incredibly challenging. It's horrible as far as the lack of support and then the failure of systems, as Eugene had mentioned. And so the film really also shows, what happens to a person, an Asian immigrant, going through, the experiences, the lived experience of America, and then having to go through the criminal justice system. What happens to you after that? What do people think? Do you think we get, shiny jobs and life goes on and we become celebrities and rock stars? No, life is very challenging. That's what I appreciate about the film. I think everyone needs to see this American experience. I'd love for both of you to add.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for saying that. I think too, what we also want to emphasize with this film is look at how Asian Americans responded to this injustice. And we hope people can take tremendous inspiration from this very unusual combination of people who found solidarity with each other and united around Chol Soo-lee's cause. You're talking about first-generation Korean immigrants, including church-going grandmothers who are politically conservative, uniting with young Asian American college-age activists, radicals who self-identified as communists. And so that is such a striking and almost mythical type of movement that you almost have to see and hear to believe in our film, just to know that it actually happened. This is the truth that we're telling. To overturn 2 murder convictions in the American criminal justice system, that's really almost, that is doing the impossible, as Ronko Yamada says in our film. And yet Asian Americans did that at a time when our community had very little political power. I think it's also just, it brings tears to my eyes, because when you look at this, here was this poor Korean immigrant street kid, not a model minority. He wasn't an undergrad at Berkeley, he was living on the margins, dropped out from high school. Here he was, and the criminal justice system deemed him disposable. But then a group of people, thanks to this journalist, K.W. Lee, looked upon him and actually said, no, you actually are worthy of our time, attention, love, and care. And we're going to devote, all our efforts to you, to free you, and try to right this wrong. And so I think that's the aspect of this story that we can actually take inspiration from and draw lessons from today, in terms of what are our roles individually or collectively to create a more just society. And we also want to challenge our own Asian American community, the issues that we embrace, and we need to think about issues like policing in communities of color, like incarceration, like reentry. Criminal justice reform should be one of our issues as well. And so that is something that, we hope our film can help put us in that history, so it arms us with that kind of consciousness.
And there's something about this story that, someone else had put it this way, and I thought it was just so eloquent. It's not just about preserving history, but restoring history. It's an act of restoration of what we have as our history. And it a little bit begs the question of why this history wasn't better known, compared to other cases within the Asian American community. And Chelsea Lee himself had some ideas about this, about sort of, his case being a little bit, not as clean as other cases like the Vincent Chin case, for example, which is much better known than this case. But it sort of just asks this question of what we expect of our heroes, and whether we need our heroes to be perfect for us to celebrate them. Because if we sort of held that standard, then maybe this history might have stayed forgotten. And I think for us, it was just our mission to not allow that to happen. This history is just too important, and this moment is just too incredible. And so, as we've screened the film, what's been really remarkable is the depth of connection that audiences have to Chelsea Lee, and sort of this binary that was perhaps, that's perhaps out there of, okay, this incredible movement, but Chelsea struggled afterwards, is not really the right one to think about at all, and maybe isn't even in opposition at all. Instead, what we've seen is that there's been a way that people have responded to the movement and really celebrated that history, but also seen Chelsea as a human being and understood that that it's not about judging him by his mistakes, but by everything he'd been through and how much he'd fought to get through it. And so we're hoping that our film can really be not just a celebration of that moment of resistance, but of Chelsea's resilience as well, and of just seeing him and all of us as fully human.
Considering really everything he went through in his life, but especially thinking about kind of his post, it's hard to say post incarceration, because he did go back to prison for 18 months, I guess, around the 1990, somewhere in there. But after his original conviction was overturned, and the prison yard killing conviction was overturned on appeal. Do I have that correct? So anyway, that part of his life, I'm just kind of wondering, and you have great clips of him talking, times when he sounds optimistic, times when he really sounds bitter. Do you think he was happy at any point with his life? I don't mean just like a momentary happiness, you tell a joke, but at any point kind of felt any satisfaction or just kind of peace with himself?
What Ranko Yamada said was that she felt like, well, she said this actually at the funeral, she wished he had more happiness in his life, but that she did know that the happiness he did have, many of those moments were spent with the people from the Defense Committee. And these are the select activists actually who decided to stick by his side even after his post-release troubles. And what Eugene and I discovered after working on this film for so long was really, when you think about when his own mother was in a way abandoning him after that prison yard murder case, that's when KW entered his life. That's when this movement of people entered his life. And we realized they became sort of a surrogate family for him. We all long for family and home and unconditional love. And in a way, they became like his family. And so the fact that he spent the last act of his life trying to honor them by speaking publicly about the movement, and not showing bitterness and saying, like, you put this incredible burden on me as a movement and as a symbol, and it was too much for me. Certainly he felt that, and that was part of his truth. He did express that, but we think he came to a place where he still wanted to give back. He still understood that what these people did for him was something worth celebrating, and was something actually that could be that people should know about, because it could inspire current and future generations to mobilize around causes like his. And so he knew how important that was. And he, I think what happened was, it's not only hard to undo the damage racism can do, but it's also hard to undo all the scars and demons that he had just from his very childhood. And so that was so hard to overcome. And so, it sounds lofty, but we actually hope our film helps to give Chol Soo Lee peace. And, I spoke about the heaviness in the funeral that sort of was the impetus to make this film. And when we think back now, it feels like Chol Soo Lee wasn't at peace, because he probably knew that when he left this world, and didn't get a chance to say goodbye to a lot of people, that they're carrying an ache for him, that there's this pain. And in fact, activists have told us, like, when they would think about Chol Soo Lee, even as proud as they are about the movement, they feel a little bit heaviness and this ache because his life was so hard. But it's interesting that after watching the film, several told us that they feel like a lightness now, or they feel at peace. And so when they think about him, they can actually have sort of that sense of closure and peace. And we do feel like even the act of making this film and having them talk and reflect on what happened, they were allowed to go on this cathartic journey. And so, Chol Soo Lee, it's hard to know how he felt at the end of his life. We would hope he'd have peace, but again, we hope that the film actually also helps give him that kind of peace.
Who has seen the film and what has been their response to it?
Yeah, many of the activists have seen it. Yeah, including KW, and they've been amazing. They've been tremendously supportive. I think everybody was wondering when the film would get finished, if the film would get finished and what it would turn out like. And so they seemed like they were pleasantly surprised, and they were just. We've been very lucky. They've embraced the film so powerfully. And KW Lee said the most amazing thing. He watched it and he said, "At last, Chol Soo Lee is free."
I wanted to add to that. I had read somewhere, though, that you also are getting inquiries from professors and scholars who want to add this to their teachings or even, their lectures, and wanting to talk about the case.
Yeah, we have been, and I think that's just been such an important goal for us from the very beginning, to really share this history with Asian Americans of all generations, including the younger generations, and to really have that educational outreach, because this is our history. And I think just over the course of seeing this film out in the world, we just see vividly what happens when people can reconnect to their history. They feel more rooted, they feel more grounded, they feel more connected, not just to themselves and as Americans, but to each other as well. And just historically, it's sort of this fascinating point, because it came not long after the term Asian American was invented, to replace the old term Oriental, and to sort of seek sort of a self-defining pan-ethnic political kind of organizing vehicle for that to refer to. And this was a moment that reflects that. You have these unlikely sort of solidarities that Julie was talking about earlier between all the groups of people who were involved, and it just connects so deeply with today, as kind of Michelle, you were talking about, as we all sort of are defining what Asian America is, because just by all of us being here, but with everything that we do, we are defining what Asian America is. And to see this moment where that act of defining Asian America meant that they sparked this movement and got this man off of death row, there's just a power to it that I think can't be denied. We're just so thrilled and humbled just to be able to be in this position to share the film as we have been able to have the opportunity to do.
Now, as Michelle mentioned, it's opening tomorrow here in San Francisco. Is it opening elsewhere as well? Or what I'm getting at is, how can our audience here of this program find out about it? Where can they see it, or where can they get a list of upcoming premieres?
Sure. Yeah. As you mentioned, tomorrow it opens in San Francisco theatrically at the Roxy Theater. And then next Friday on August 26th, it opens theatrically in Los Angeles at the Laemmle Royale in LA. And it's also going to eventually be on Mubi, our distributor streaming platform, as well as on PBS's Independent Lens. And so we don't have dates yet, but we will keep you posted if you follow us on FCSL_film. And also you could go to Mubi's website, mubi.com/Free Chol Soo Lee, one word, and you can find listings and links there.
And I know, this is not a question that you probably want to answer, but what's next?
No, it's funny. It's just because I often liken it to when you've had your first child, and you're just exhausted. You're gleefully happy, right? For having given birth to this beautiful child, but then you're so tired, and people are asking, when are you going to have your second? So I think Eugene and I have a bit of that feeling. We're still actually working quite hard to actively promote this film, because it was quite an accomplishment to finish it. And we have to credit our entire team, by the way, our producers,
Absolutely.
Sue Kim, Jean Chen, and Sona Jo, and so many others on our team for making this possible. But yeah, there's so much involved to try to make sure people see the film now. And so our efforts are really dedicated toward making sure that it gets out into the world as much as possible.
And was it mostly finished by the time the pandemic hit, or were you still doing post-production, or were you still gathering materials? I mean, what role, because we've heard, we've talked with people who are either writing books or working on films, and strangely enough, the pandemic gave them a time to focus very much on their project. Others that completely, if it was something where they were having to travel a lot, it completely threw a wrench into the things. What role did it play with this film?
Yeah, it made us alter our plans. We had planned on filming more. We had planned on filming more interviews, as well as other sorts of impressionistic material. But of course, especially since so many of the people who were involved with the movement were older, we just couldn't take that risk of exposing anybody to anything that could potentially be dangerous. So we hungered down, and with our team, we decided that we just needed to sort of look inwards into what we had already, which was already kind of this community archive, this sort of underground archive that we discovered, and really embrace that as our identity for the film. And we also brought on an incredible archival producer named Brian Becker, who really helped flesh out visually like a lot of the language of the film. But yeah, by doing that, I think we were able to, with our team, just really create something that's more immersive and more, I think, like transporting to that time. Like it was the hope. And so just using that archival footage and really leaning into that and really understanding some of the things we've talked about before, like just how important it is for us to see archival imagery of ourselves as Asian Americans, because we've seen so little of it in the past, and just the power that can have to really make us feel, again, rooted, to fight against things like the perpetual foreigner stereotype, this idea that we're all just came here. Like this archival footage, like just strikes a direct blow against that. It shows that we've been here. It shows that we're part of this history. So the pandemic allowed us to really just sort of embrace that identity for ourselves in the film.
Last question as we wind down here, and thank you so much for spending the hour with us and for this film, this very important film that showcases, a big part of our community as well as our history. But this question is about you. One thing that you do to just completely let go, decompress, and take care of yourself.
Interesting. Yeah, I try to go for walks when I can, and yeah, that's actually something I learned as a cancer survivor, to go for those walks, and it's good exercise, but also you need that moment to yourself to reflect and to recharge.
There are so many answers. Some of them are bad habits and some of them are good habits that I could respond to that with. But I think the thing that today has been defined by in terms of those moments is when my 4-year-old daughter comes up and grabs my hand away from the mouse and like drags me away from the desk, to let her do that, and to just connect with family and just be present in that way, and to let the inbox just kind of continue to collate material in the background without my having to monitor it.
John, do you have a last question?
I'm not going to top that. I think that was good for all of us to think about.
Eugene, Julie, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for the film Free Chol Soo Lee. If you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, go check out the film. It premieres tomorrow at the Roxy. And if you're not and you're interested in finding out more, you can go to fcsl-film.com. And thank you to all of you who are joining us. John, you've got the last words.
Okay, well, thank you again to our special guests on today's program. Last but not least, thanks to all of you for watching or listening to this program. You can find more programs at commonwealthclub.org/MMS. Stay safe and have a good rest of your week. Goodbye.